Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Transit Talk, RVA Rapid Transit's regular webinar series. We're very thankful to have you here with us today. My name is Kendra Norrell, and I am the board president of RVA Rapid Transit. As many of you know, RVA Rapid Transit is a nonprofit dedicated to educating and advocating for frequent and far-reaching public transit in the Richmond region. I am also the community engagement coordinator for the City of Richmond's Office of Sustainability, and we are currently in the process of RVA Green 2050, the city's equity-centered climate action and resilience initiative, which connects directly to public transportation to help equitably reduce greenhouse gas emissions. To begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping details. We are recording the event today as usual, and we will have it up shortly on our YouTube channel for folks who couldn't be here today, or if you just want to watch it again. We do ask to keep down background noise, to please keep yourself on mute during this event, but definitely add questions or comments in the chat section, and we will have time for Q&A based on those questions and comments. Today, our transit topic today is transit governance. As we know, there has been a lot happening around public transportation with the creation of the Central Virginia Transportation Authority, or the CVTA. 15% of the CVTA's tax revenue coming from an increase in the local sales tax and gas tax provide a dedicated funding stream for regional public transit and mobility services. The past fiscal year during COVID, that generated $20 million. And for this coming fiscal year 22, this is estimated to generate $28 million for regional transit. The CVTA has authority over how these funds are spent through its approval or veto power over an annual regional public transportation plan that GRTC provides. We'll talk about that some more in a moment. Part of the legislation making the CVTA also requires the CVTA to evaluate the governance structure of transit services in the Richmond region and report the results of such evaluation to the governor and the General Assembly. Nelson Reveley, RVA Rapid Transit's Director of Operations, will be giving us an overview of this topic today. But before that, we're actually going to kick things off with a bit of a news update on the state of transit right now, including some perspectives from RVA Rapid Transit's Riders Voice program. The first update is on zero fare. There has been a lot of talk and support recently for GRTC to continue its zero fare policy as a way to keep providing financial relief for everyday bus riders. As many of you know, 54% of GRTC's riders have household incomes under $25,000, and 79% have household incomes under $50,000. In exciting news, GRTC's proposed budget for fiscal year 22 includes funding to continue zero fare for at least another year through June 30th of 2022. Those funds are coming through support from Federal CARES Act. GRTC's board will take its final vote on the proposed budget at the next meeting on June 15th. It's key to note, though, that funding for continuation of zero fares past fiscal year 22 will depend on state and local support. So stay tuned for more updates on that front. Next, GRTC has also completed its regional public transportation plan for this year. As you'll recall, this is the plan that GRTC has to annually submit to the CVTA for the CVTA to review and ultimately vote on, regarding how the 15% of CVTA funding allocated to the GRTC is spent. You can see here a list of some of the possible expansions, but it's important to highlight the earliest any of these may begin is not until fiscal year 2023 or July 1st, 2022 at the earliest. The major issue pushing back these expansions is the need to recover fully from this pandemic time to regular operations, combined with a need to recruit and train more bus operators to implement any service expansions. There has been a challenging bus operator shortage for transit systems across the country. You can see GRTC's full draft regional public transportation plan at planrva.org/transportation/CVTA, and that will also be put in the chat box. This plan should be up for CVTA approval at its next meeting on June 25th. Finally, as a reminder, the GRTC is still running for essential trips only, and masks will be required through at least September 13th. Now I want to turn things over to Faith, who has a rider perspective to share through our Riders Voice program.
Thank you so much, Kendra. All right, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. And as As many of you know, my name is Faith Walker. I am the RVA Rapid Transit's Director of Community Engagement. At its core, my work focuses on amplifying and supporting stories, concerns, and interests of everyday bus riders in decision-making about public transportation in our region. Now, to that end, we've launched a program called The Writer's Voice, which is aimed at gathering and amplifying those stories and ultimately helping it make it easier to get around everyday life using the bus. While it was, of course, challenging to do some engagement during the pandemic, I've been able to meet some people face to face. And I wanted to play a clip for you from a gentleman by the name of Martin Hill. I met him at the bus station in front of Southside Plaza. And so we're going to play that right now for you.
My name is Martin Hill. I take several buses. I take the Pulse a lot to go to Willow Lawn. I take the 1C, the 1A, the 1B, Hall Street. I take the 86, Walmsley Broad Rock. I take the 2A, Forest Hill. And I take the 14 a lot, which carries me to Lombardy and to where I live at Chaco Bottom. I'm a single father. Remaining the bus free would help me out tremendously. I'm not going to be able to get to my job till 12 o'clock. And then people wanted me there by 9 o'clock this morning. Because I had to run to his virtual schooling this morning. I've been on the bus since 7:30 this morning. And I'm just now going to get to work by 12. Because I had to go on one side of town to the other. But see, it's going to be Chesterfield where he goes to school. You understand what I'm saying? But this is the city of Richmond. So it's my job as a parent. I have to keep him where he's supposed to go. But like I said, we've been on the bus since 7:30 this morning. Wow. So that hurt. But then they wonder why I'm not making any money. You don't get paid unless you work. So I'm not going to get there to 12. So I work from 12 to whenever I can. But is it fair on him because he stays with me? You kind of see, well, I'm a single dad, so I can't afford daycare full time, so he has to stay with me when I work.
So we appreciate Mr. Hill sharing that story with us. And as you can see and hear, that frequency up and down certain corridors is essential to people's everyday life and can affect their income. And so we are gathering more bus rider perspectives and stories like this on a regular basis. So I want to strongly encourage you, if you are a regular bus driver, rider, and to give the hotline a call, or you can participate on our online survey. You can reach out to me directly to share your views. Now, if you know any regular bus rider that you think could be open to sharing, please reach out to me. They can email me at faith@rvarapidtransit.org. Or they can visit our website for further information, and Nelson will put that link in the chat. So what I'm going to do now is transition it over to Nelson to do the presentation regarding transit governance.
Thank you, Faith. And greetings, everybody. Good afternoon. It's really wonderful to have you all with us. The topic we have today again is on transit governance. And as I think many folks on the call and the webinar right now know, this is a kind of ever evolving and a pretty complex topic. So we'll have a chance at the end for folks to share and talk, adding questions, adding comments. And if as we're going along the way, things seem amiss or anything seems missing, please make note of that either in the chat section as we're going or when we're having a chance to talk towards the end of our time together. I think a really helpful place to start, though, is with just a bit of a history around transit in the Richmond region. So as lots of y'all know, GRTC has got really deep roots. It goes all the way back to 1860. And for over half a century in Richmond, things were focused on transit around the streetcar. As many of y'all know as well, we were the first place in the entire globe, if not the universe, to have streetcars, starting here in 1888. And they ran until 1949. And there was kind of a transition over a couple of years from 47 to 49 after the Second World War, where things were switched over to buses. And we've had a bus system ever since. So for the last 71 years. There were some other pieces that were added in along the way. In 97, we had paratransit services added in. And then of course, in 2018, we had the BRT line added in, which is similar to a bus, but also its own type of transit service. If you think back to those streetcar days though, one helpful thing when we're thinking about transit governance and when we're thinking about regional transit is to consider the ways in which about a century ago, the streetcar was serving as a interconnected or a way for the region to be interconnected. And the region, at least in terms of population, was a much smaller geographic area. You have here a map of the streetcars from 1930. And then on the right over here is more about a little bit smaller and harder to see, but that's from around 1900. But in a lot of ways, these streetcars served as ways that were connecting the region as it was at the time and allowing for really suburbs on the north side and the west end and the south side. And that's also kind of helpfully shown if you look at the ways in which the city grew over time. It kind of tracked with the streetcars. If you lay them over top of that annexation map, that red line or that red oval is basically the growth of the city for its first 170 years or so to about 1900. And this green line is the early 20th century. And that's early 20th century is really where you see the streetcar growing and growing. And you see that it's really making it possible for folks to stay connected as part of the region. One quick thing along these lines as well, when we think about, again, GRTC and its history and its growth through the streetcar days, it had a whole bunch of different names and different companies that it became along the way, starting out again as Richmond Railway in 1860, and then Richmond City Railway Company in 1881, Richmond Union Passenger Railway Company in 87. That's when the streetcars really start kicking in. And then Virginia Rail and Power Company, an electric power company, actually was running things for about 2 decades before it was no longer allowed to have transit services. And then Virginia Transit Company got it in 1944. And it finally became the GRTC that we know and love in 73. And that was when the city of Richmond purchased the transit company from Virginia Transit Company with federal support as well as some local funds. So at the time, it was about $5 million of federal funding and about $1.3 million of local city funding. If you do the inflation calculations there, the federal funds were about $38 million in today's dollars, and the city, or the federal funds was about $30 million, and the city's funding was about $8 million, so $38 million total. When the city bought the transit service and created the Greater Richmond Transit Company, a city council had appointed 9 board members. And I imagine that was most likely going alongside with the sense of the 9 jurisdictions. But that's how the governance was running to start. 9 folks appointed the board by Richmond City Council. I think it's helpful when we're thinking about transit conversation around governance as well as to consider why cities were buying transit companies at the time. A lot of this was driven by the Urban Mass Transportation Act of 1964, which started allowing federal funds to go towards support for transit systems in localities throughout the country. It's helpful as well to recognize that a lot of that push originally was focused on trying to make sure folks could still get into the city if they were starting to live outside of the city in the surrounding counties and the surrounding suburbs. which again, were no longer being connected by streetcars, but now with the interstate system, folks were driving in to downtown. So there were also a lot of mayors who were lobbying for this type of federal support to support transit systems as well, in the hopes of keeping employers downtown, in the hopes of keeping customers downtown, in the hopes of keeping residents in their jurisdictions. Along those lines as well, there were transit systems that were starting to close. So Virginia Transit Company itself was set to close September 1st, 73. So right as the city moved in to purchase it. So one of the big questions, again, thinking about the history here as well, is where's the bus going to run and who's paying for it? What we're going to have a chance to do right now is take a little bit of a walk down memory lane by looking at some past news articles from the Richmond Times-Dispatch around public transportation. You can get all these on the Library of Virginia, and it's kind of a never-ending rabbit hole. But I think some of these ones you'll find interesting in terms of what the conversations that were happening 50 years ago are the same conversations that we're having today in a lot of respects. One article that actually was before GRTC was formed and before the transit system was bought by the city, but it's kind of hitting on this idea of commuter buses from the suburbs and the counties into the city, was an article about a express bus experiment that they were exploring in large part because, quote, no matter how many streets and highways are built, public transit must continue to be a key factor in alleviating downtown traffic congestion. There was a concern at the time around congestion with traffic in the city itself. But this was an effort to, again, working at that time with the Virginia Transit Company to create some types of express routes that would be able to make it so that folks could connect into the city still, even if they were living outside of the city. One of the most amazing and depressing headlines of all time, hearing on buses draws one person. This was from May 22nd, 1973. And this was as they were starting to move, the city was moving towards buying the transit system and forming GRTC. But I will say that one person lived on Forest Hill Avenue and really wanted to make sure that the bus was extended out further so that he could use it. That's why he was there. But this article actually highlights one of the key points that it pops up kind of continually and seems to pop up continually decade after decade, which is the question of who is paying for the transit services. And so when GRTC was formed and when the city bought the transit system, there were some lines, not many, but there were some lines that were going into the counties. And there was a live question in 73 around who was going to continue paying for those lines. So for instance, there was a line on Monument Avenue in Henrico going out to St. Mary's. There was a line going up Lakeside as well, Lakeside Avenue. There's a line going down to DuPont in Chesterfield. So that, yeah, there was this question of who's going to pay for those. And in really fascinating ways, you had folks being worried about the city paying for county lines. And at this point, right when GRTC was formed. So part of the article reads, nearby counties expect the present services to continue and there may be requests for more service, but city officials said they will expect the counties to pay their share of the cost incurred. City Attorney Conrad Maddox Jr., a director of GRTC that will contract with another company to operate the buses, said last night that if citizens of Richmond are going to subsidize these routes, they're going to want to know who's going to pay for the service to the counties. This service to DuPont and other areas in the counties is not going to pay for itself, Hurd said. Leidinger, GRTC's board president at the time, also read a letter from Michael Ritz, a Chesterfield planning director, another like fascinating quote from this article, saying that there were indications of, quote, a need for service to Cloverleaf Mall immediately, and that we certainly want to maintain service to DuPont without interruption. So you can see over the course of the last 50 years, there's a lot of things that sound familiar. In some respects, some of the roles are reversed at that initial moment. We've talked some about how there was this heavy interest in commuter service. This is a really powerful article from 1974 about concerns for folks who need transit to get around, and it's not an option of having a car and taking the bus instead. Again, this was from June 1974, and part of the article reads, a new group called Metropolitan Transportation Coalition, MTC, asked the board of directors of the Greater Richmond Transit Company last night to give priority attention to the expansion of public transportation for Eastern Henrico County. Assistant City Manager Elijah Rogers, a GRTC director, offered a motion to put the GRTC on record as favoring that priority, but City Attorney Conrad Maddox, also a GRTC director, amended Rogers' motion to study area-wide expansion, not just Eastern Henrico. The successful motion authorized Resident Manager Henry Church to meet with Henrico and Chesterfield County officials in order to study the transit needs of all Henrico County and Chesterfield County as such needs may be served by GRTC. This is 1974. That same conversation around regional transit was happening then. One other quote that's not up here, but I will read it just because it's powerful and it gets across the point of the importance and the essential nature of public transportation. So this group, Metropolitan Transportation Coalition, had created a position paper arguing for the need for expanded public transportation in the region. And they noted in that paper that many persons concentrated in the city have not been able to follow the industrial and commercial expansion because they do not have access to an automobile. And quote, public transportation had not kept pace with the economic expansion into the counties. Unless this problem is addressed, these citizens will be left standing at the end of bus routes looking off in the distance at job opportunities, the Metropolitan Transportation Coalition said. So again, a lot of the same issues we've been wrestling with for decades. A quick tour of some headlines, jumping ahead about a decade into the mid-'80s, when the last time it was a particularly live question around having regional public transportation and regional public transportation governance. So this is June of '87. Henrico Chesterfield study Metro Transit idea. And then a little later that year in December, regional group urged to plan public transit. There was a group with the MPO that a consultant group that was urging a regional public transportation system. A few months later, in April of '88, city invites the counties to be GRTC partners. Localities may expand bus service, and council gives tentative nod to transit plan. It's interesting going back through these articles, and it would be even more interesting to be able to get hands on the meeting minutes from city council, as well as the board of supervisors, as well as GRTC's board. But some of the concerns from the council was just questions of how this whole system would work. And again, that question of who's paying for what, and what are all the details going to be. Following along, you have headlines of a Metro GRTC. Counties expected to join city in favoring bus plan. Chesterfield agrees to buy GRTC stock. This is April of '88. The city, the two counties announce accord on starting metropolitan bus service. This is April of '88. Regional mass transit a step nearer, 1988. Henrico is interested in bus deal, but wonders how to make it fair. That was the fall of '88. And that kind of led to what we're all kind of familiar with right now around transit governance. Regional transit support idea lacks Henrico. That was April of '89. Henrico foregoes participation in the transit system. Chesterfield votes to join with the city in running GRTC. There's an editorial around a GRTC authority and the questions of how it would all work. And then City Council approves taking Chesterfield as GRTC partner, and the city and Chesterfield sign agreement that July of '89. Interestingly, in that agreement, the city and Chesterfield County both paid $50,000 to become co-owners of GRTC. There was a piece in which GRTC also bought back some of Richmond City's old stock. So the city wasn't necessarily really spending that 50,000. But if you do the inflation adjustment in 2021 dollars, it's coming to around $100,000 when they were both purchasing. And Chesterfield vote to join was a 3-2 vote, but there were the push, at least as reported in the papers, to join was around the opportunities it would provide for Chesterfield to grow public transportation. And some of those articles read, Chesterfield could have contracted with the city for local bus service in the way that Henrico was doing, but instead chose to pay the $50,000 for 5,000 shares of GRTC stock and a chance to control its destiny. As Jeffrey Applegate, chairman of Chesterfield Board of Supervisors, said, anytime we look at growth, a key ingredient is transportation. My colleagues and I felt that we should have some control. Studies show Chesterfield is a key player in public transportation because of growth. If we know we're going to need public transportation, why not own at least a part of it? Henrico County, and on the flip side, decided to stay with just purchasing service instead of joining the board and buying in shares on the board, largely out of just questions around how it would all work and how the funding would all work. In kind of like interesting ways of a flip of that article we saw from the city 10 years prior, 15 years prior or so from this, the city worrying about who was going to pay for what. In this case, it was Henrico saying, we're not sure how all the fares are going to work or how all the subsidies are going to work between the different jurisdictions. So things that sound familiar. GRTC's structure when Chesterfield joined was to go from having 9 directors to having 6 directors, 3 appointed by Chesterfield County and 3 appointed by Richmond City. And this is how things have been since '89. So for roughly the last 3 decades. From that point, from '89, when there was a lot of talk around regional public transportation and steps towards it, to today, or to kind of the mid 20-teens, things were relatively status quo on the transit front, not necessarily tons of expansions. But we all know that has started to shift a lot over the last 5 years. And one of the big catalyst moments was in 2014 when the Tiger Grant was awarded for the BRT. And then in the midst of all of that BRT excitement, there was the Greater RVA Transit Vision Plan, that plan that folks have been talking about, even going all the way back to the early 70s. Now there was a very robust plan for regional public transportation that got finished in 2017. And then in 2018, of course, the BRT came online, as well as a revamp of Richmond City's lines. And then Henrico added expansions, kind of the largest expansion they've had in a quarter century. And that started in the fall of 2018 as well. And then, of course, in 2020, Chesterfield, with state support, launched that pilot along Route 1 to John Tyler. And then in 2020, the CVTA, of course, was established, Central Virginia Transportation Authority. So all to say, after a long period of almost 4.5 decades of things kind of not necessarily making tons of progress towards regional transit, the last 5 years have had an enormous amount of growth and comparatively. So transit governance and CVTA, this question of kind of where we are now. Again, CVTA legislation was passed kind of in the midst of the pandemic just a little over a year ago, and CVTA first met this past fall. So a lot of this recently, things have just been getting up and running. But the CVTA has 5 main functions and powers, 2 of which are very specifically tied to public transit. One of them is the Transit Governance Report, which is kind of nearing its end now. It was originally going to be due December 1st of last year, but now is due June 30th, so the end of this month. And it's reviewing the governance structure of existing transit service in the Richmond region, and then evaluating the possibility of having something, creating a transportation district, and then reporting those findings to the governor and to the General Assembly. Another big power of the CVTA is its regional prioritization process for transportation projects that are, again, regional in nature, that it can spend 35% of its funds on. Third is, of course, regional public transportation. 15% of CVTA's funds go towards regional transit and mobility services. And those funds are kind of annually approved by the CVTA in terms of how they're spent through the regional public transportation plan that GRDC puts together. We'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily. And then, of course, 50% of CVTA's funds go back to each of the localities for the given locality to decide how they would like to spend that on transportation. And that, that the wide range of possible ways that could be spent. But that 50% is given back to the localities proportionally based on how much tax revenue is raised within their jurisdiction. If you look at those estimates in terms of how much might be raised per jurisdiction for this coming fiscal year, that is in this chart right here. So through those gas tax and sales tax, it'll be 187 million. That'll be coming in roughly, or it's estimated to, for this coming fiscal year. When you take those numbers and you look at transit and public transit funding coming from the CVTA, you can see how that breakdown of that 15% comes from all the jurisdictions that are coming together to support regional public transportation. And you can see the breakdown of their, given jurisdiction's contribution from the CVTA to GRTC, but also a breakdown of their contribution based on GRTC's overall operating budget. And you'll see here, when you think about the overall operating budget for FY22, from the CVTA side of things, there's about 14% coming from Chesterfield, about 6% coming from Hanover, 14%, almost 15 from Henrico, and about 7.5 from the city. And then from some of the more rural jurisdictions, about 1%, all coming together for about 40% of GRTC's operating budget. And that, again, these are the CVTA funds, those dedicated streams for regional transit and mobility services. When you think about public transit funding from localities, from their general operating budgets, this is how things look for FY22. You've got about, again, 8 million coming in from the city, about 4 million coming in from Henrico County, and about 1 million coming in from Chesterfield. And when you think about the percentage of GRTC's operating budget for FY22 from the different jurisdictions, from their general operating budgets, you've got about 13% coming from the city, about 7% from Henrico, and about 2% from Chesterfield. And the other jurisdictions, although some of them have other paratransit services that outside of GRTC that they use, they're not using any of GRTC's services out of their general operating budgets for FY22. When you put these together, right, side by side, you can kind of helpfully get a sense of the funding that's coming from CVTA and then the funding that's coming from the general operating budgets of given localities. I think a lot of times it's very easy to think about merging these two things together, but I think it's important to think about them as kind of distinct animals, in large part because the public transit funding that's coming through the CVTA is kind of annually overseen and voted on by the CVTA based on that regional public transportation plan that GRTC is doing for how it'll spend these dollars over here. The dollars on this side are more jurisdictionally specific, and each jurisdiction is thinking about how it wants to allocate its funding and its sources over here. So each jurisdiction has general oversight on how those dollars are spent through its instructions to GRTC on how it would like those monies to be allocated. So certainly there is crossover in terms of funding that's coming from any given jurisdiction, but they are distinct things, whether it's coming from the general operating budget or it's coming from the CVTA, in large part because of how the money is decided to be allocated, with the CVTA dollars being guided by that regional public transportation plan. One of our research fellows, Richard Hankins, has done a lot of work mapping out all the different pieces and all the different folks involved in regional transit governance and funding for the Greater Richmond area. And this is a working document, so he's always working on tweaking it and enhancing it, but a little zoomed in. In some respects, it can feel like a lot, and I think that's because, like a lot of folks have probably experienced on this call, it can be a lot of things to juggle and try to keep in view. But here, the green lines are the funding lines, and you can see the regional sales tax are coming in here into the CVTA, and then that is going out into regional transportation projects. That's 35% that goes towards that. There's 15% that's going to GRTC. And then there's 50% of those sales tax funds that are going back to the jurisdictions proportionally based on how much tax revenue was raised within a given jurisdiction. If you think about other funding that's coming in for GRTC, you clearly have some federal funds and some state funds. You have some other institutional players like VCU. You got other jurisdictions like Petersburg. And then when fares are being charged, you have bus riders as well. But federal funds are helping cover those right now, as Kendra was mentioning at the opening, and supporting zero fare. It's helpful to highlight as well that there are other mobility service providers, other paratransit providers for a lot of the jurisdictions around the region that are outside of GRTC. And those are important to know that they are there, and they provide services that are akin to the care services that GRTC provides, but just in different jurisdictions. Over here on the right, you see a lot of action with Plan RVA, and that is because Plan RVA, is doing a lot of regional collaboration and support, particularly around visioning and planning clearly. And that is, of course, where the Greater RVA Transit Vision Plan for regional public transportation was spearheaded. It was at Plan RVA. It's also helpful to note that Plan RVA staff are rocking and rolling and doing lots of good work, both with the CVTA as well as with the Richmond Regional Transportation Planning Organization, as well as with the Planning District Commission and Plan RVA proper. So there's a lot of different moving pieces. The blue lines are all the folks who are involved with voting representation on the CVTA itself. And then the purple lines are, again, governance of GRTC right now. And GRTC, at the end of the day, is the main transit provider and operator, and where, the lion's share of the planning is done for regional transit right now. So again, lots of different interconnections across the board for all the different pieces. But this, particularly as and Richard has this in a blog post, as you take down the layers, it really highlights the ways different pieces interconnect. All right. Into the home stretch. We know right now, the big question right now is, what will transit governance look like moving forward? And as y'all have seen, I imagine in the papers, Henrico very recently has very expressly said that they would like to be part of transit governance. And in large part around that sense that their investment in transit is growing significantly, and that is through things like the CVTA. And there's a desire to be part of the regional, more intimately part of the regional transit planning, operational capital spending, bus stop amenities and litter control. All those types of things are the expressed reasons that Henrico would like to move from being a client for transit services to being part of the board, and buying into the board. Um, as you remember, just a few moments ago, we were talking about how the CVTA, part of it was creating, or part of its legislation entailed evaluating governance structure for transit service in the Richmond region. That study, again, is underway right this red hot second, and actually kind of towards its tail end. It had really, a couple components, strategic assessment of GRTC, an evaluation of what a transportation district could entail, options for different governance strategies, and then the final report itself. You can find everything that you could imagine and watch a whole bunch of videos to your heart's delight on that plan and its progress at planrva.org/transportation/CVTA-transit. There's the Transit Service Governance Subcommittee that has been working on that report. There's a meeting tomorrow at 11 a.m. That you could watch and join in on. I'm just going to highlight right now some of the key things that they've lifted up in terms of the key questions around governance. The three things that they've lifted up are decision-making and accountability. Who's got the power over those decisions around GRTC's operations? They highlight the need to kind of consider that there's existing representation on the CVTA board in terms of how those CVTA dollars are spent. They also highlight the need to consider pros and cons of having elected officials on GRTC's board, which is something that Henrico has expressed interest in. They highlight the need to think about GRTC's board representation and who might be involved. And they highlight the implications for GRTC's ownership. And that's really kind of the question of how a shift would be set up, or how a shift could be set up if there were a shift. Kind of in closing here, I think it's really important as we're thinking about transit governance to think about what the board's purpose is. It seems like the board's purpose for GRTC is overseeing the implementation of the operations, the admin, and the planning. And it's helpful to note that in distinction from the role of funders, jurisdictional as well as institutional, who have that discretion over how their dollars get spent. Again, the CVTA over the CVTA dollars through approval of that regional public transportation plan in any given jurisdiction or any given institution over how its dollars get spent based on its request for service. These two things are connected, overseeing implementation of operations, admin, planning, as well as funding decisions about where and when bus lines run. But they are distinct things. They are separable things. So I think whatever form governance takes, there are three things that I think are really key. Number one is maintaining professional, high quality operations and making for GRTC and making steady progress towards the greater RVA Transit Vision Plan. And I want to take this just as a moment to note how often some things get conflated that it's really important to separate. If you see this headline, I'm going to pick, we had a lot of RTD fun earlier, but I'll pick on the RTD a little bit here. A headline here that says, once among the nation's worst transit systems, GRTC earns national acclaim a year after the pulse opens. I just want to highlight here, it's all too easy to miss and mix up the difference between issues around funding and a really robustly funded public transit system for our region. That's one thing. And the second thing is operations and how it's run. I think it's really important to always keep in mind that GRTC has historically been underfunded compared to other regions, but it has been also award-winningly well run. So questions around like that worst being a sense of historically underfunded is very different than how it's run. And again, I think whatever form governance takes, well, something that's got to be stressed is that GRTC is able to run professionally and at a high quality, again, with an eye towards growing towards that full regional system. Second really key thing, whatever form governance takes, is that there's an opportunity to enhance core bus riders' input and feedback and guidance for the board. I think that's really rooted in being able to be sure to fund robust community engagement, highlighting that as a priority. But that's also could come through things like statistically weighting conceivably all of GRTC's surveys to rider demographics. GRTC's annual report has a really helpful and colorful breakdown of GRTC's core ridership demographics. So when GRTC is doing outreach, it could be that surveys are statistically weighted to match these rider demographics. You could also, when you're thinking about the board, have board member expectations to ride the bus with at least some regularity. And you could also have aspirations that board membership would reflect the demographics of GRTC's core ridership to all extents possible. So again, the second key thing, whatever form governance takes, enhancing core bus rider input, feedback, and guidance to the board, I think is really critical. And then third, whatever form it takes, I think it's key to deeply consider the best ways to organize GRTC's board representation. And this is conceivably one of the trickiest things, but I think it's a really crucial one to think through very carefully. And first, that just means kind of noting again that distinction between CVTA funding and locality funding. Again, with CVTA funding being overseen by the CVTA annually, of where those dollars get spent and how it gets spent, and that being different than how a locality might be funding transit through its general operating funds, or even conceivably some of its proportional CVTA funds. I think deeply considering the best way to organize GRTC's board also goes to the question of the role of the board in implementing high quality transit, and that being really its kind of core key function. And then third, kind of considering ways that there could be indexing board representation, whether it's based on operational hours or operational miles or boardings and riders per jurisdiction. I think that's a very important thing to think through as well, and carefully consider what's the best way to represent, to have that representational split on GRTC's board. All right, we've got a little bit of time now for Q&A. I'm going to check out the chat. Oh, the article, Lisa was asking, did the article say why Henrico declined to sign on, I guess, back in the 80s? Yeah, this is a place where it would be really helpful to be able to dig into the board supervisors' minutes, because the articles themselves were a little vague in terms of just saying that there was concerns about how the funding would work, and how there was also concerns about liability, and it wasn't 100% clear what the liability concern was. All right, I am also going to, because we have a few minutes, allow folks to unmute yourself if you have a comment or a question you'd like to share verbally. With, again, the preface that transit governance is such a work in progress. If there are things that seem amiss or missing from what we had a chance to talk about today, very much welcome those thoughts, as well as any other comments or questions.
Good morning, Nelson.
Yes.
This is Amelia.
Hey, Amelia, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. Everyone else is, want to know how you're doing, and I'm sorry I've been an MIA, but it's a lot of information you shared, and it certainly was interesting. But I just want to share with you all today that I put a part of the history. I was a rider on the streetcars.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it just brought back a lot of memories to me, and I just want to share that with everyone. That was in 1945.
That's fantastic.
And I traveled from Churchill, 25th and Fairmount to Navy Hill School.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yes, and I want to thank you also for all the work that you all are doing, and I just can't wait until we start meeting one-on-one.
Yeah, it will be really nice to be able to get back.
Yes. Okay, so that
Thank
was
you.
all I had to say.
Thank you so much. That's awesome.
Nelson,
Yes.
this is Virginia Coles, and I also was a streetcar rider. There was a period there in the early 40s when streetcars and buses were running. I guess that was throughout the 40s mostly. But anyway, what I want to do is ask the classic question, and that is why Chesterfield had 50% ownership in GRTC, but so little service, so little transit service in Chesterfield County.
Yeah, I mean, it is a classic core question, like you said, Virginia. Thank you. And I'll say the vote, it's helpful to remember as well, the vote for Chesterfield to join was a 3-2 vote. It's also interesting as a side note to say that as that conversation was happening in 88, 87, 88, 89, it was a simultaneous conversation around bus service on Midlothian Turnpike being provided by a private provider because businesses on Midlothian were asking for it. So there was this simultaneous piece where Chesterfield was very open to a private bus going up and down Midlothian in response to employers asking for bus service. And was looking to join, again, through a 3-2 vote, ownership over GRTC, but was not, looking to pay for service through GRTC. And yeah, I don't know if I have an answer aside from that the color commentary around the going on at the time. I don't know if I have a better answer. But it will say one piece that does kind of think about that precise question. It underscores how big a moment really this is. That line that's running along Richmond Highway right now. The fact that it started and the fact that it's been having good ridership, even in the midst of the pandemic, is an enormous deal. And the fact that Chesterfield's working on getting it further expanded. Further down Richmond Highway is an enormous deal. And if you think as well about I realize today we're not talking about regional transit, but if you think about the regional transit system, and I think that very first link that's in the chat box to the regional public transportation plan, the degree to which Chesterfield's been 100% in the mix of thinking about expansions, again, particularly around Midlothian. It's really a very new day on that front.
Good.
I see one comment from Lisa that several ex-urban counties in the CBTA have expressed interest in having a claim on their share of the 15% that goes to transit. Are there any thoughts on how to deal with this issue when local transit service is not feasible? Yeah, I think this is one of the kind of the growing pains for thinking through the CBTA and how that 15% is spent. And I think this is a really helpful piece to have in that conversation too, of thinking about those CBTA dollars as unique dollars in distinction from general operating budget dollars. And maybe conceivably an opportunity and an opening to think about having some of those dollars spent on GRTC service. Although again, this pairs as well with the governance map that a lot of the ex-urban and the more rural jurisdictions have some paratransit service already that's distinct from GRTC. But I think that goes to the heart of that question of, for those CBTA dollars, thinking of them as part of a regional system and recognizing that that's where their most power comes, is serving as regional transit as opposed to being divvied up in really small ways. Anna had a question, and this might be our last one because we're running out of time, is what can we do as individuals in this moment to best support GRTC and better funding operations? I think that the most important thing right now is continuing to, as always, like reach out to your folks who are your elected representatives and just sharing your interest in this topic. in a lot of respects, there's a host of issues on the table right now, everything from expansion to zero fare. And that's all on the tail end of kind of cleaning up with the pandemic, as well as trying to grow the number of bus operators so that expanded service can get out on the road. So I think one thing is certainly reaching out to representatives, and another is if we are having increasingly volunteer opportunities with RV Rapid Transit, specifically around our Better Bus Stop program, which we will actually be having our next transit talk on. And I think I will, Faith, if it sounds good, hand things off to you to wrap us up.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nelson. And it was awesome to hear the feedback today. I think we should maybe do that again next week. I just want to thank everybody again today for being here. Please note that our next transit talk is coming up in 2 weeks, and it will be noon again on Thursday, June 17th. We'll be talking about better bus stops and the steps to improve them, and also improve amenities centered around them. Now, only 5% of GRT stops currently have shelters, and another 20% only have benches. So we clearly like to see those amenities grow and increase over time. We will also be touching base on the issue of litter, real and perceived at bus stops, the ways it could be a barrier to expansion of transit, and how we can help address it as well. If you're not already on our email list, you can keep in touch with us and everything that's happening. You can visit rvarapidtransit.org. I promise you, we won't flood your inbox. We'll just only send you essentials. And thank you again for being here today for this discussion of transit governance. We will email you this link and recording once it's up on our YouTube channel. So if you missed some sections of it, feel free to watch it again and share it so we can continue this discussion. Thank you all and have a good rest of your day.